Quad66. Alright, so let's start getting into tunes. The first one I'm going to start with is actually a Whoop tune. It's actually the newest tune for me, but I just got curious after I saw the comment about the Whooptopia pilots. Basically, all the top pilots apparently are flying Acro, so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to revisit that and see what the Whoop kids are up to. I did want to go over this build real quick so you know what I tuned on, so that you could see, is this similar enough to your Whoop, and will you have good similar results, or is it going to be quite a bit different? So the build, this is just stuff I had laying around. I grabbed this old, it's fairly new still, this Flywoo board. It's the F411 all-in-one. It's got the built-in VTX. For the RC link, I threw on a Happy Model EP2. The motors, I just grabbed some 0802s I had. These are CNCdrones Golds. They're the older ones, 18,000 kV. The props, I like quad blades, and so these are the ASI quad blades. These are nice and very well balanced, and that's why I like flying them. Canopy's a little heavier. It's a Goober that I had sitting around, and I threw in a 199C camera and flying with PH2. So my flying weight with this, so the dry weight on this quad is, it's not terrible. It's a 22.25 gram quad, and I typically fly with these CNCdrones 300 milliamp batteries. And so with that, my all-up weight that I fly at is 30.2 grams. Now the issue is most of these Whoop boards don't have black box logging built in. So I did log with an open logger, and I should have thrown the SD card. It's really negligible weight, but to get the exact weight. But since I'm adding weight there, I went down the smaller battery to kind of balance it out, 250. But still, it comes in a little bit heavier. So my tuning weight, you can see 3.13 grams. Actually, let me see. I think it's 3.14. 3.13, 3.14. All up weight that I was tuned at. And so, for this tune to work for you, obviously the weight's going to have to be somewhat similar, somewhere in the ballpark. Anyways, let's go ahead and jump into Betaflight and take a look what's in the tune. Alright, jumping into Betaflight. So I've got this tune up in Betaflight as a preset, and if you want to grab this tune or any of my other presets, you can go and add my GitHub branch as a preset source, and then you'll be able to access all this stuff that I have in there. So in terms of this tune is the tune plus other pieces. So like all the tunes, we've got other pieces including things like filtering, including things like the base setup, and you need your RC link. And if you want to understand or you don't understand how that all works together, then check out the video I did before on Betaflight 4.3 setup, kind of go into that in some detail. But there's some differences here that I really have to highlight, and so I'm going to go through a couple of those. Hopefully it's not too redundant. In terms of this tune, so who's this for? Specifically, this tune is to fly whoops in kind of like in a race style in acro mode. If you race an angle or if you like to fly an angle, go get EmuFlight. The angle code's better, and I think you'll just have a better time. And if you want to try this, then go ahead. But seriously, just go grab EmuFlight. Also, if you fly freestyle and aren't really like trying to go through gates and stuff like that, this may be a good starting point, but I don't think it's necessarily the ending point for you, and I'll talk about a couple spots why that's true. So in terms of the pieces that go along with this, one of the things to talk about is kind of this base setup. So we've always got to do a couple things to kind of get the quad set up. And specifically here, the difference here is that from my other like 1 and 2S or 1 to 3S stuff with the open props is we're using crash recovery. So since we're trying to race here and we're racing in Acro and we're probably going to bump stuff, we want this little crash recovery feature where when you hit something, it detects it and throws it into angle mode just for a fraction of a second, hopefully just long enough for you to regain control back in Acro, and then you're on the way. In order to do that, what we have to do is we can't turn off the accelerometer. Normally right here there's a line that turns off the accelerometer, and the reason we do that is to save space. So these CPUs are small, we're already overclocking them to 120 hertz, megahertz, millihertz, megahertz, and turning off things like accelerometer saves space. But we can't do that to use this crash recovery. The filters are also quite a bit different. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but basically I'm using dynamic notches here instead of the RPM filters, and I'll talk about why. So jumping into the configurator, the way this looks different, it's a couple things. Is one, we've got the accelerometer on. Because we're not using RPM filtering, we're not using dynamic idle, you can probably bump this up to 8K if you'd like. Power and battery is pretty similar. Important, get your minimum cell voltage in here. On the whoops, I like 3.2 because I'm flying on those new Drone Gold batteries. And what you really truly have to do, as soon as you see that land, now you really have to land. If you're going much below 3.2, you're going to damage those cells. So just keep that in mind. Our PID tuning page is going to look generally pretty similar, where we've got to get our RC link stuff in here to get our feed forward stuff set up. And what we're doing here is, I'm still turning off the Dmax, and I'm still using thrust linearization. In the case of the whoops, these little whoops, 48 kilohertz, I am using 30%, so this is a little higher thrust linearization. But then the biggest change in my mind is kind of turning off the dynamic idle. Instead of using the dynamic idle, what we're using is just the regular old D-shot idle value. So here you can see that we've got bidirectional D-shot off because we're not using it, and instead, for the dynamic idle, we're just using 13%, and that's pretty high. And I'm specifically doing that high for a reason. Basically, the specific scenario is when you're coming into a gate and you're low down close to the ground and you're coming in a little too fast, and you sort of have this natural tendency to try and slow down, and you do a little bit of throttle chop. The problem with the throttle chop is if the motors spin down too much, you start heading for the ground, then you raise the throttle, and then you bump up too high, and you kind of get this vertical oscillation going up and down, and that's kind of a mess. So what this 13%, this high idle value does is it kind of helps stabilize that, because it gives you a little natural floatiness at the bottom of your stick range. So when you do that throttle chop, you don't drop speed and altitude, or motor speed and altitude too quickly. I did, I would use dynamic idle to try and get a similar effect to that, but the problem is you can't turn this high enough. So with dynamic idle, it maxes out at 100, and that's not quite enough. What's kind of interesting about that is if you spin up your motor, so if I put in this case, this corresponds to 14%, so 1140, really it should be 1130, but that would go to 13%. If I spin up my motors are at 8,500 RPM, which is interesting because if you're paying attention, this went up to 100, which corresponds to 10,000 RPM. So dynamic idle, even at 10,000 RPM, effectively is less than 8,500 using D-shot idle, because dynamic idle lets you spin down below that 13%. It actually lets you spin, or lets you drive the motors at like less than that. It lets you go down to 1% as long as the RPM is high. So what that means is that even though this dynamic idle number sounds high, that throttle chop really spins down those motors, can torque them down pretty quickly, so you get more of that throttle chop effect. And so I can't set this high enough to use it in Betaflight, so that's why we've made that switch there. So filtering, a lot of this looks the same. We're just pushing these sliders all the way over to decrease our latency as best we can. If you cranked up your, if you went up to 8K, you can probably turn this off because you don't need it for that aliasing effect. And then, so we don't have the bidirectional D-shot, so we don't have our RPM filter option here anymore. Instead, we're using dynamic notches. I'm using 4 of them. If you want a little more filtering, you could probably jump that up to 5. But the big thing you got to get right is this number right here. So the max frequency, I've got this set at 800. 800 is high enough to get me above my motor bands. Now, I'm flying on quad blades with an 18,000 kV motor. That is sort of tame compared to what some people are doing, and so you might be hitting higher RPM. So if you've got bi-blades or like 20,000 kV motors, something like that, you might spin up past this, and if you do that, you need to raise this up high enough so that you give these dynamic notches the range to get up and stay on top of that motor band up into, I'm not sure where you need to put it because I haven't logged it, but you might need to go, I don't know, 900, 1,000 here. I'm not sure exactly where, but you might need to bump that up, so keep that in mind. So finally getting into the PID numbers themselves. With the numbers, what I've really tried to do is stay on the sliders here. And specifically, I try and get the sliders into a position where you have room to move them up and down and not have any one slider maxed out, so you have room to kind of adjust things easily. And when I look at the numbers where I ended up, and so this is tuning off a black box, this is my first time tuning a whoop off a black box. These are the numbers I ended up with, and they're a little bit different from my prior tune. So my hummingbird, which I was flying on angle code, in angle mode using Betaflight, I had more derivative, had around 85. The proportion was about the same, around like low 100, kind of in that range. And obviously Betaflight doesn't have feed forward, so that was a little bit different. This quad, I'm a little bit lower on a derivative, and it's actually kind of close to my 3-inch open prop build, 1S build. I've also compared these numbers to, there's a preset in there for a whoop for Betaflight. It's kind of more of an official one. And the numbers are similar, but they're a little bit different. They're a little bit lower on the proportional and feed forward. The derivative is similar. So when you're in here, when you're tuning, the biggest thing to really get right is this ratio between your D and then your P and I and your feed forward. One of the things I've done is, most of my quads I'm squaring them up a little bit. So you can see here, so the default for Betaflight is to put a little bit higher numbers on pitch across the board. And so specifically on this quad, on the D term, I've squared it up. So I've taken this pitch down a little bit and it evens that up. So you can see that here we're at 6970. So that's pretty even. That's more even than, see 103, 108. But basically, once you have your ratio of P to D, and you kind of have this locked in, and also like once you have your ratio of like P to feed forward kind of locked in, you can kind of just like, move these together, and you can move all these together simply by getting into your master slider here. So now this makes it pretty easy. So for example, this one is a little bit P and feed forward dominant, so if you need just a little bit more damping, you can just hit a click or two, and then once you find exactly where you want that, then you can use the master slider just to kind of take the edge off the tune or make it a little bit more aggressive. So for example, if your quad is kind of a little bit angry when it's just sitting there and you want to take the edge off of it, you can move this master slider down just a tiny bit. On the other hand, if the quad just feels like you just want to get a little bit more locked in, a little bit more aggressive tune, you can just bump it up a couple clicks. And so that kind of makes this nice. Once you've got these ratios set in, you can move that master multiplier pretty nicely. And obviously you can adjust this P to D ratio pretty easily there. I found most of the other stuff, in terms of like P to I haven't really had to like mess with that. I found that, leaving I where it's at seems to be doing okay. And that's mainly because now we're getting such good set point tracking that you can use a high I value and it's not really causing much trouble. You're not getting a lot of I buildup. So how does this look? How does this fly? First thing to talk about, we'll kind of talk about the noise and why I chose the dynamic notches instead of the RPM filters. And that's kind of like from this, picture right here. So what we're looking at is we're looking at a gyro scaled. So this is the gyro raw unfiltered. And this is a plot of the throttle percentage versus the frequency. And so what you can see is two different basically groups of noise. One group of noise here is your motor band. And you can see that the band changes. So as we go up in percentage of the throttle, that frequency increases, and that makes sense because this noise is from the motor spinning causing shaking. So as the motor spins faster, it's going to shake faster. It makes sense. On the other hand, this group over here is frame resonance, and it doesn't move with throttle. It basically says, well, I don't care what you're spinning at. I like to vibrate kind of at this frequency. This is my resonant node, and that's just what I'm going to do because I'm a frame and that's what I do. So you can see in these little quads on roll especially, it's a very like frame resonant dominant versus the motor bands. Pitch is a little bit different story, whether it's because that battery is really stiffening things up or the extra weight along the pitch axis. Maybe that is what is changing this a little bit, but you can see that there's not as much frame resonance. The motor bands are a little bit more dominant. In either case though, what's kind of interesting is when I apply RPM filtering, on this whoop, I don't know if it's whoops in general, I think it could be because of the flexi frames. The RPM filtering just doesn't take out this motor band as well as I'd expect it to. It doesn't take it out as well as it does on the open prop builds with the nice stiff carbon fiber frames. And like we expect, the RPM filtering is definitely going to struggle with this stuff down here. It just doesn't go after frame resonance. So what I found is that it's not really doing great on the motor bands, and it's not really doing much about this, and so I found a better strategy is just to get rid of the RPM filtering and just use the dynamic notches. And in fact, when I looked at this, it's kind of interesting going back and forth between the two. The dynamic notches are doing a better job on the motor band than the RPM was. And so a little side benefit is that we're using less CPU and a little less latency, so it's kind of a win-win, which was kind of interesting. Kind of makes me want to experiment a little bit more with that on the OpenProp builds, but the OpenProp builds tend to be a little bit more motor band dominant because the way they work. So just to show you really quickly what gets into the D. So D, basically, we take our raw gyro, we filter it down, then it looks really good, and then we basically amplify it back up with our D term. And so that's how the D looks. This is what you're putting into your motors. This is your loss of efficiency. This is motor heat. And it sort of is what it is, but we just need that D to get it to handle well. And I just find that I'm willing to tolerate a little bit of that to get less latency because the quads just handle better with less latency from the filtering. In terms of looking at how this flies then, let's go ahead and get rid of that. And now we're just going to look at our traces here. So now in red, we've got our gyro. In yellow, we've got our set point, so that's for roll. And then in green, we've got our gyro for pitch. And in purple, our set point for pitch. So overall, what we're looking for these is what we want to see is that when our set point moves, we want to see our gyro follow. And that's what we see here. So set point goes, we're going into a snap roll here. So this is really hard into the snap roll or max velocity, and then we end the roll. And you can see the quad, the gyro basically jumps right on that, doesn't do anything weird across the top, doesn't oscillate, and then comes back down and gets close but doesn't quite latch back on the end of the roll there. You never want to just kind of like look at just one, you want to look at several, and that pattern seems to persist where we got nice tracking at the beginning of the roll, does okay cross through the middle of the roll, but doesn't quite jump back on at the end of the roll. What's interesting too is, and I've looked at multiple logs, the set point just seems to do a little bit better. Granted, my stick motion is a little bit different on pitch than it is on roll, but it's just interesting that on pitch, the quad has an easier time of getting that gyro onto set point when I'm stopping the roll. And I've, there's just a couple examples here, but I've looked at multiple logs and that seems to be true. On this particular log, this is the one, just, whoops, just sometimes they act like whoops and you lose track of things and they have a struggle. And that's one example of what we don't want. But that was just kind of more of a random fluke than kind of a persistent thing. So when we're testing our tracking our flips and rolls are one way we do it. The other way we do it is with these twitch moves here. And so basically these moves were either like rolling back and forth or we're pitching back and forth, and we're basically kind of just trying to shake the quad, shake that gyro off a set point is effectively what you're trying to do. And what you can see here is that this is doing pretty well, but we get a little bit different of a thing than we're dealing with on the flips. So here, what we're actually seeing here is a little bit of overshoot. So as the set point comes up, you can actually see that the gyro overshoots it. And so what's kind of interesting about this is that it's sort of the opposite thing than we saw on the roll. Now this I can pretty easily clear up. So if we're overshooting, we're just slightly underdamped, or we've got too much P and feed forward. So you can take care of this just by knocking down the P and feed forward a little bit, or you can just increase the D term a little bit, and that'll tighten this right back up. But if you do that, you go back to these, and then that worsens this problem. This one's kind of one of the better examples. This, I think it's a little bit more dramatic here. Yeah, this one shows up a little bit here. So we want the opposite thing here. So if I add D term here, this gyro is actually going to lag even more. What we want here is we want more P and feed forward to push this gyro onto the set point. And so it's where I landed at was basically kind of splitting the difference. What I said is, okay, if I'm flying Acro in kind of racing, this kind of stuff is more important to me. The twitch stuff side to side, this is more important. So what I did is I tuned this right to where I start to see the start of a problem and stop there. And then I just tolerate the fact that this quad isn't going to quite arrest these flips quite as quickly as it should. And it is what it is. But at the end of the day, like this is, I said this is an Acro race tune, so are you really that worried about this? Now, if you're flying freestyle, maybe you worry a little bit more about this. Maybe that's like, but for Acro racing, maybe Acro racing, you maybe make the argument that I care almost nothing about this, and really all I care about is these twitch moves, and so maybe you might make the argument, and rightly so, that maybe the thing to do is just back off, P and feed forward a little bit on this tune, and increase the D term a little bit on this tune, and you might be spot on right. What's kind of interesting about, we talked about the flips on the pitch, and the pitch, like the flips on these twitch moves, actually does really well. So look at the tracking there. This is exactly what we want to see. Like when we look at this is almost like there's only one line here. That's when your set point, where your gyro is staying right on top of that set point. And that's like really, really nice set point tracking. The other thing we want to do is we kind of want to go down the flight here. So this is a pretty short flight. These are small batteries, 250s. And so they start to sag, pretty quick. But I'm using the small battery specifically to get the weight closer to my real flying weight. But even as these batteries sag, basically the twitch moves still look good, and the flips and rolls, let's see, pick up one here. Flips and rolls still look good, so even as that battery starts to sag, our tune is still where it needs to be, and that's because we're using that VBAT sag compensation. So this is although this is still subjective, this is, I think, a little bit more objective than just feeling, what you feel from the sticks. But the last thing I'm going to do is get you a little bit of DVR and show you what this looks like in the air. Keep in mind, flying indoors Acro with whoops is not the thing that I think I'm most proficient at. So, a good pilot can make anything look good. The opposite's true too, where kind of an average pilot's going to make anything kind of look sort of average-ish. All right. Until next time, cheers.